Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus Podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'd like to reflect with you on my new book, Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace, which is just out from Orbis. This is the second podcast of a two-part podcast project, and it's all part of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin with a little prayer. So I invite you, wherever you are, just to take a deep breath and just to relax and recenter yourself. And together, let's enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you personally, unconditionally, and infinitely, and everyone everywhere, too. And let's welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us. Just take a moment to ask for whatever grace you need to follow the nonviolent Jesus more faithfully and to do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus and to surrender our lives and our wills to you and to work for a more nonviolent, more just world. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, that we might do our part then to help end poverty, racism, greed, injustice, fascism, war, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, that we might be your holy peacemakers and welcome your reign of universal love and peace on earth. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thanks again, friends, for joining me. This is part 2 of a 2-part podcast on my new book, which is called Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace, which I invite you to get at orbisbooks.com or your local bookstore, wherever you get books. In the first podcast and first episode, I was telling you how this journey began, the beginning of the pandemic, when the kid who taught my gym class, whom I call Will, asked me to be his guru, he said. And I started teaching him about meditation, and he started calling God universal love. And then the next thing you know, universal love showed up to him one day and overwhelmed him. And he came and told me that he felt he was called to become an extension of universal love. And so for many years now, since the lockdown, we've been discussing this. And we were also doing writing practice together on all these spiritual themes, and I didn't know it, but they became this book. So in the first part of the book, I reflect on the importance of daily meditation, letting go of control, living into an intimate, trusting relationship with God, surrendering everything to God, and trying to do only God's will from now on, not our will. So today, I'd like to share with you part 2 and part 3, the rest of the book. And part 2 is about the connection between surrendering our will to the God of universal love and how that surrendering is connected to nonviolence. And then the third part, part 3, is how the life of surrender to God and God's will has specific, I think, shocking political implications for universal love, peace, and nonviolence, which for me is the key to the book. So if you've read a lot in mystical writings and all, what I am trying to do here, my own conceit, is to take off from the classics, such as Jean-Pierre de Caussade's famous book from, I think, 300 years ago called Abandonment to Divine Providence, which millions of people have read. And I'm trying to unpack what his, among many great classics, these teachings of abandoning our lives and hearts and souls to God mean in a time of permanent warfare and extreme poverty and white supremacy and fascism and the very real threat of nuclear war and destruction and catastrophic climate change. And I'm trying to suggest that in the light of the life of the nonviolent Jesus, if we surrender ourselves to God and try to do only God's will from now on, like what would that look like? I'm not going to do my will anymore. That means we have to step out of ourselves into the world and take nonviolent direct action like the nonviolent Jesus does, through selfless service, nonviolent resistance to injustice, and the public work of welcoming God's reign of disarmament and justice and peace. I think the problem here is we all want the peace and comfort of God's love, but we don't necessarily want to get involved and do God's will, much less stand up in public and engage in the will of God as public peacemaking and nonviolent resistance and entering the fray to insist on justice, disarmament, protecting creation, and so forth. In other words, the problem as I see it is no matter how much we all say we love God and want to follow Jesus, in fact, we're all trying to control God and do our will, not God's will. I see that running through the Gospels, actually. That's what the male disciples are always trying to do, control God and argue with Jesus about their will. And that's the problem with every one of us and the whole human race and the whole world. And it's the point of my book. I'm trying to invite us to, all of us, to let go of control and let God run our lives and surrender ourselves to God's will, which is universal love, universal compassion, universal peace, and therefore universal nonviolence. To let God do with us what God will. And we get to enjoy the ride and become, as my young friend said, extensions of universal love and peace. That we then welcome God's will and God's reign of love and peace on earth with all its glorious social, economic, and political implications, come what may, no matter what the cost. It all sounds good to us. So early on, I'm saying to young Will, about the importance of meditation, and I'm also trying to talk with him about nonviolence. And shortly after we were meeting, he comes in one day and says, well, someone at his workplace put him down. And he immediately wanted to blow up at that person. And he's raging inside. And he made a real sharp comment in response and turned and walked away. And later he regretted it and felt bad and says to me, what should I have done? How do I keep from getting mad and snapping at someone, even if someone puts me down? So I say, well, what happened in your meditation that morning with universal love? Did you meditate? And he said, no, I forgot. And I don't know. I said, I don't know if it's possible to be loving, peaceful, just, and nonviolent on our own. I think we need to meditate and surrender ourselves to the God of universal love every day, every morning, as if for the first time, as if we'd never done it before, as if our lives depend on it, and then throughout the day, and also find a community of seekers, friends, peacemakers, churchgoers to support us and to share that journey of total surrender to God with all its interpersonal and national and global political consequences and implications. If we meditate every day and return to our relationship with universal love and center ourselves in God and universal love and really give our lives over to God and universal love, we will keep remembering universal love because we all suffer from amnesia, and reignite the desire to be an extension of universal love and then be open more and more to God, to universal love. Or at least we'll be a little bit more grounded in universal love, which means we might have a little bit more awareness of other nonviolent ways to respond when we get triggered and provoked. Even if that means going back and apologizing to the person we snapped at. So if we surrender ourselves in the encounter with universal love, I think universal love, part of the process of life, which is the same as the spiritual life, I call it life, not the spiritual life, is that universal love disarms us and heals us and fills us with life, the Spirit of God, which makes us more compassionate, more loving, more present, more mindful, more nonviolent to ourselves and others, because in the process we're letting God lead us through our day. So you could say, for example, well, I meditate, I pray, I seek God every day. But I still want to explode when someone steps on my toes or pushes my buttons. And again, that's the point of my book. I'm always interested in the lessons of nonviolence and the plea of the nonviolent Jesus. And what I'm learning at this ripe old age, unless we are surrendering ourselves completely to God's will over and over again, we're going to be stuck in our own self-will, which means selfishness, ego, dare I say stupidity. And that can only lead to problems, whether remaining stuck in resentment or anger or fear or anxiety or worry or whatever our issues are, and chasing our own egos. And that always leads to we want money, pride, attention, career. We're relying on ourselves. Next thing you know, we're relying on our bank accounts and our weapons and our nation and our military and our wars, and we're descending quickly into a hell of our own making. Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, among others, practiced a profound inner serenity to God. And I think that was the key to their total nonviolence. And it has to become the bottom line practice for us if we too want to deepen in gospel nonviolence, especially at this moment in history which we're asked to live in, as our country and the world are collapsing around us, as we're witnessing the end of the American empire and all hell breaking loose and the rush toward nuclear destruction and climate change. Gandhi wrote that God's will for the entire human race is that we practice nonviolence. That's quite a statement to make. And that if we try to do only God's will and not our will, and that's our intention every minute of every day, we will never harm another person in thought, word, or deed, much less hurt someone, much less kill someone, much less support war, join the military, have a gun, build nuclear weapons, or sit by passively while our sisters and brothers are being killed around the planet and we destroy the creatures and Mother Earth. The goal, I said to young Will, my friend, is to try to become totally nonviolent through our daily surrender to the universal love, to the God of nonviolence, through meditation and study and practice, so that the day will come as we're living into universal love, where we respond instinctively with nonviolence, no matter what happens. I think that's doable and possible. I think that's the lesson of the Sermon on the Mount and Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Dr. King's, that when you truly are on the journey of becoming an extension of universal love, a peacemaker, you can move into total nonviolence, at least more and more, way farther in progress than we are now. But it helps if you spend quality time with your God every day and surrender yourself to God regularly. Some of us have to do it hourly, every 15 minutes, every minute. And so you're constantly being disarmed and recentered in God's love. Without that consistent daily practice, it's easy to get lost in our own self-centeredness and ego, and the next thing you know, we're off doing what we think. And the minute then someone does not treat us as we expect or demand or go our way, and we get triggered or annoyed or frustrated or impatient or resentful, I have a long list here, afraid, angry, violent, all these things happen to me, we regress to our inner teenager and snap at someone. Or if you're like me, to your inner 3-year-old and you just have a temper tantrum. In this case, I said to young Will, well, you might have taken a deep breath and said something like, I feel hurt by those words. In other words, use nonviolent communication, or it's sometimes called mindful communication, which uses I language to help others know how you feel and what you need, instead of pointing the finger of blame at others, saying things like, you did this to me, you're to blame, it's your fault, you're the problem, which is responding with anger and judgment and violence. And then we walk away, and that doesn't resolve the incident, it only makes it worse. And you end up feeling ashamed and guilty, and we want to avoid guilt and shame. So I was saying to young Will, we want to try to not respond with the same harmful spirit or use hurtful words or the tone that's used against you, but we really don't want to walk away passively either. So we want to stand and engage in a spirit of nonviolence and love and compassion. And I think the wisdom is to share how it has affected you if you can. And maybe you will discover that the person didn't mean to hurt you, but meant something else entirely. But no matter where you are as you pray through these moments, which are all practices for bigger moments to come down the road, right? Right there on the spot, you pray for the person who's hurt you. You forgive the person in your heart, and you offer a blessing upon that person. Every human being has to learn the art of blessing other people, beginning with blessing people in our families. This has to become the new normal of our daily life. We want to go through life praying for others and blessing everyone we meet. And we want to figure out creative, nonviolent, alternative responses that help us maintain our peace and help others to reclaim their peace or to maintain their peace. Like the old days, we'd say, we don't lead others into sin. And that's how then more and more God's peace will spread and will help be part of disarming one another. So we need to practice this every hour in our daily lives, whether we're on the grocery line or the picket line, always trying to be centered, surrendered, and nonviolent. And happily, a few weeks later, Will came back and announced that someone else had snubbed him at work. And this time, instead of barking at the person, he talked very reasonably in a calm, peaceful voice. He was really centered, and he felt much better afterwards. And he said, and I quote, "It works if I stay centered in my breath and peaceful and calm. I found I'm better able to respond like this when I've begun my day in quiet meditation with universal love." And being the wise elder, I said to him, "I told you so." And that's when he rolled his eyes, of course. Yeah, so part 2 of my book, just trying to make everyone smile. It's not working, I can tell already. I explore all these themes. Nonviolence is remembering who we are, looking deeply within into our own violence, trying to be nonviolent to ourselves, confessing and apologize the harm we've done to others, constantly forgiving everyone who ever hurt us, the practice of living every moment in the presence of the God of peace, and this combination of radical letting go, but also radical acceptance. And then also befriending our fears and surrendering them to God. And this section then leads to part 3 of the book, where I explore the political consequences and implications of surrendering our lives to God and doing only God's will and trying to become extensions of universal love, as young Will first said to me. So if we're going to do God's will, and we're not going to do our will, and if God is universal love, universal compassion, universal peace, and therefore universal nonviolence, then if we're only doing God's will, we will become, theoretically, extensions of universal love, compassion, peace, and nonviolence, which means what? Our lives are given over entirely now, like the nonviolent Jesus, to serving, healing, and helping humanity and creation, beginning with our neighbors around us. We do not serve ourselves or seek our own selfish will or try to get God to do what we want. Those days are over. Nor do we do the will of anyone else, such as the president or some general or the nation or some other idol. Those days are over. We serve humanity, starting with the poor and marginalized and enemies of our nation, as Jesus says, as he showed in doing only the will of God. And we engage in nonviolent resistance to all structures of violence, to all our nation's wars and weapons and corporate greed and systemic injustice and racism and fascism, environmental destruction, because we're trying to do the will of God, to be extensions of universal love, and therefore we're always trying to welcome God's reign of universal love, compassion, justice, and peace here on earth. We are servants of humanity and creation, pure and simple, as we serve our God, the Creator. Not only do we do no harm, but we seek to only do good. And that's going to have to mean stepping up and trying to stop the harm and suffering that we're inflicting, our nation and others are inflicting on others. We not only live and let live, but we live and help live. Now, I'm saying this, a little story on the side, and thinking vividly about a long evening conversation I had 35 years ago with Cesar Chavez, founder of the United Farm Workers, one of the great heroes of nonviolence. And we were talking about nonviolence, and he said all of that to me. I never heard anybody say that to me before. He told me that every morning he climbed a hill near his house, near Bakersfield, at dawn, and meditated for an hour. And then from then on, he just did whatever people wanted of him, beginning with the poorest of the poor. And he told me his life was no longer his own. He had become a slave of the farm workers. And he said if someone needed him at 3 a.m., he got up and did what was needed. He was very serious about that. Actually went and made a private little pilgrimage by myself to that hill to see where he did that years later after he died. So in the third part of the book, Universal Love, I try to unpack some of those stories and lessons and people and my own experience as I shared with young Will about trying to live out the political implications of surrendering our lives to God and God's will of universal love and nonviolence. And so you can read that in the book, and some of you may have heard some of my stories in recent years, such as leading an annual Hiroshima Day vigil in sackcloth and ashes at the National Nuclear Weapons Labs at Los Alamos in New Mexico on the Hiroshima anniversary every year, which I didn't necessarily want to do. Who wants to do that? It's quite humiliating to sit in sackcloth and ashes. And then, gosh, people want to kill you. And I was denounced left and right, even by my own parishioners, and then was kicked out of one of my parishes for this, and then punished by the Archbishop, and then eventually removed from New Mexico by my Jesuit superiors and told to stop all this peace work. And I shared some stories of recent arrests, such as when I went to the Supreme Court with Shane Claiborne and other friends, and we were calling for the abolition of the death penalty. There were 18 of us, including some friends who had lost victims to violent murder, lost their loved ones to violent crime, and who were against the death penalty. And we spent a terrible couple of days in jail. And then similarly, when I was arrested for speaking out against fossil fuels with Jane Fonda's Fire Drill Fridays group, when we shut down the Senate Hart Office building, and we were held together in a kind of an outdoor shelter area on a prison grounds outside of D.C. to way late at night in the bitter cold. And it was kind of a common social experience of perfect joy, like Pentecost. Everybody was just so full of the spirit of life and hope and peace. And we were in handcuffs. It was an amazing experience. But in the book, I reflect on two friends in particular who I think became real global extensions of universal love. And they set a high bar for me in my journey of trying to surrender my life to the will of God and going all the way. The first was my friend Philip Berrigan, like his brother Daniel Berrigan. And I haven't really written much about Phil before until this. Phil spent 11 years in prison for resisting war and nuclear weapons. It's just an amazing story. We don't even know how many times he was arrested, maybe 600 times, and just hated, and his house would be raided in the middle of the night by the FBI. He knew hundreds and hundreds of us who were in and out of jail, and he got cancer while he was in prison and was released and died 6 months later. My other great friend is Dr. Paul Farmer, my lifelong friend. We went to Duke together, and we were in this wild, crazy fraternity together. We both underwent quite dramatic conversions. And he changed medicine around the world, became the most important doctor in the world. That's what the dean of Harvard Med School told me. And founded Partners in Health, and figured out his life goal was how can we bring world-class health care to the poorest people on the planet? And he figured out how to do it. It's very doable. And he ended up founding, besides running Partners in Health, which has 10,000 doctors working in countries all around the world, he founded 3 hospitals, 2 universities, and ran the healthcare systems for a while in both Haiti and Rwanda, where he was when he died suddenly at a young age in 2023. They're mythic people, my friends, Phil and Paul, who showed me how to give one's life completely over to the God of universal love and peace. And just to let the chips fall where they may, and let your life be used for the whole human race. And you're kind of way beyond attachment to results or outcome or feeling depressed or sorry for yourself. You don't have time for that. I think if we try to do God's will of universal love and nonviolence, we're going to be uncomfortable. But it's going to be okay. That's what they show me. We have to get out of our comfort zones and take risks in public for justice and disarmament and step out into the unknown, whether it's prison or Haiti or Rwanda or wherever. And as the risen Jesus says at the end of the Gospel of John, go where we'd rather not go. That's the point. We are not in charge. We are serving God, and God is in charge, and God is running our lives and leading us, and that means calling us to get off the couch, face our fears, go out into the world, take to the streets, speak out, resist the systems of injustice and insane violence and war through our creative nonviolence, and let the chips fall where they may, which may mean starting with rejection from family and friends, or in my case, fellow churchgoers or co-workers, and maybe for some of us, arrest or jail or violent death like Gandhi and Dr. King. So this is not a feel-good comfort food spirituality, and why I don't read that much about it in the ancient spiritual classics. Because, this is why we don't really want to surrender to God as much as we claim we do or we might. Because I think in such a world and a time we're asked to endure, it's going to lead to public non-cooperation and confrontation with the systems of war and violence and death and destruction, with the principalities and powers, and the world of violence is going to push back. In other words, we're talking here about the cross. All of this is about the cross. As I'm saying this, I'm remembering an astonishing letter I had from Joan Chittister 30 years ago when I was in prison facing 20 years for my Plowshares actions. I don't know if I've shared this on the podcast, but, I got a lot of letters, and Phil and I were in the same jail cell, and we each received 50 letters a day. I think that was from like 50,000 letters. I no 5,000 letters. And everyone said, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you're suffering." And except for 2 letters I got, Mother Teresa and Joan Chittister. And Mother Teresa was like, "Oh, thank God you're suffering." That's the way Joan Chittister was too. And Joan Chittister wrote this sentence that just knocked me off my feet. She said, "You are reminding us that the only way to positive social change, to justice and peace, is through our sharing in the paschal mystery of Jesus." Wow. That when we surrender ourselves completely to God as Jesus did, when we let go of our fears and worries and control and ego and walk forward in universal love, compassion, and peace, we can just let the chips fall where they may. We can accept the consequences of our political work, to end war and killing and injustice. Because God is now running our lives, and we can move into a new, deeper level of serenity, trust, and both humility and strength rooted in God. So in the third part of the book, I return to the story of young Will, who had been coaching in the art of meditation and surrender and nonviolence. Now, this had been going on for a year or two when he packed up as the pandemic was starting to wind down, and he moved to Mexico, and then he moved to the Bahamas, where he ran the health, exercise, and sports programs at a large resort. And I didn't say anything, but me being judgmental, I was like, that's not what I quite had in mind. But I didn't say that. He was my friend. And he was immediately pointed into leadership positions and offered a job to live in the Bahamas for the rest of his life, being very well paid and very secure. And after a while, he was going to go on a vacation to New Zealand. He was going to do some serious mountain hiking in the South Island on one of the great mountain ranges and then meet up with this girlfriend. And there he was, sitting one day by himself, resting on this mountaintop in a scene literally right out of Lord of the Rings. And he's taking all of this in when suddenly a bright red New Zealand rescue helicopter flew overhead pretty fast. And he felt overwhelmed once again by universal love, by God. And he knew in an instant what he would do for the rest of his life. As a young kid, he suddenly remembered all he wanted to ever be was a firefighter and a paramedic. But this was a spiritual calling, a way for him to live out his calling to be an extension of universal love. In fact, he had been meditating every day and working on his nonviolence and trying to surrender himself nonstop. And at that moment, halfway around the world, in that magnificent setting of creation, he felt called by universal love. So he leaves the resort in the Bahamas, walks away from that life, enrolls in the local college EMT class, goes to the top of his class, and then is immediately hired by the LA Fire Department. And within weeks, it's just months after this happened, he's driving an ambulance all night long in the streets of Los Angeles. And he's calling me, and I can't believe what he's going through. Within the first couple of weeks, one night he came upon a drive-by shooting that left 3 men who had been sitting, talking peacefully on their front step, covered with bullet holes. It was like probably, a gang initiation. And he was sent to treat the worst one hit and saved the man's life. Will would call regularly from then on with incredible stories of saving lives. A year ago, that wouldn't have been imaginable. Then he announces one day that he's been accepted into the #1 paramedic school in the country. And his first day, there's 50 firefighters in the class and just one other lowly EMT. But he starts studying 20 hours a day for 6 months. And again, he's at the top of this class. He gets an incredible job as the #1 paramedic in a California fire department. And to this day, spends 4 to 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, saving lives all day long. I would not have predicted any of this when we met. And each day he tells me, he reports that he's living out the adventure of being an extension of universal love. So I unpack some of this with him, and we continue to talk about the social, economic, and political consequences of this calling of surrendering our lives to God. One day he said to me, "Isn't surrendering to universal love just giving up? Doesn't that mean we're going to be completely passive?" I knew what he meant, but it's strange. On the contrary, I said, if we surrender ourselves completely, repeatedly over our wills, every day, our lives, to universal love, to the God of universal love and peace, in response to our own reality of selfishness and violence, and then the world's insane violence, oddly enough, instead of being passive, we become more active than ever because we're being used. God is like, oh, here's someone who's willing to work with me. And we end up becoming public activists or jump into the fray like you did. And we try to do what we think universal love, the God of peace, wants us to do, and then immediately we're thrown into suffering, humanity, and creation. So universal love is not passive at all. Universal love is always active. That's why there's nothing passive about active nonviolence. Nonviolence, as Cesar Chavez said to me, is public action, public action, public action for suffering humanity, for justice, for peace. It reaches out to include, welcome, reconcile, disarm, heal, bless, and embrace every human being as sister and brother, and widening that embrace of universal love to and welcome every creature and all creation, so that all might know God's infinite, personal, universal love and dwell in God's universal peace and nonviolence. It's hard to believe that any one of us can make a difference in such a world. But I think in the exciting adventure of surrendering toward becoming an extension of universal love of the God of peace, we don't even think that way anymore. That's not even a question for us. I certainly saw that in Dan Berrigan. He said to me over and over and over again for 35 years, we are not attached to the results of our actions. We go forward anyway. We do what we can, and we let God make a difference through us. So that no matter what's happening around us, even the hell of the world, we know a deep inner peace, even joy that nothing can touch, even when we're grieving the world. We do what we can to spread universal love and its social, economic, racial, political, even environmental implications. If we pitch in, pick a cause, and contribute once, twice, or 3 times a day, doing what we can for justice, disarmament, and creation, but it's based in a surrender to the will of God, so that God is leading us, and we never give up, and we keep at it, well, then God's going to use us. And it's very interesting. That's how positive social change works through history. We could talk forever about this. And my great friend, the historian Howard Zinn, told me this. And you can read it in his books. He said that's the crucial difference in every historically successful grassroots movement, was the steadfast commitment of ordinary people who had given over their lives to doing something noble every day for the bottom-up grassroots people power movement, for justice, for disarmament, for whatever the cause was, whether it's the abolition of slavery or segregation to workers' rights or the right of women to vote, wherever you looked at it historically. In other words, to universal love. And even if it seemed to make very little difference, it doesn't matter. And then you get to the point, Howard told me, that you get so wrapped up in universal love and the struggle for justice and the grassroots movement that you're not even thinking about the positive outcome anymore, even as you might be strategizing for it. Now, Gandhi took this to a very fine level, a kind of postdoctoral detachment of outcome, where we take positive action for the good, but we're doing the good because it's good. And even as we're giving our lives in total surrender to God, and maybe even the outcome, we're not attached to the outcome, but we know the outcome is assured. Why? Because God's running the show, not us. And we've gone deep into that, into surrendering to God's nonviolence, God's universal love. And that's what Howard Zinn said. He used a very interesting word. That's when nonviolence becomes contagious. That's how movements work. That's how positive social change is. And the degree that it's not contagious is because we're following our own wills, our own ego. But eventually, if we can really surrender to the will of God, you see this in Dr. King and the civil rights movement. That's what my friends who were his friends, when they talk about it, they said it was not at all what you'd think. And for those who heard Andrew Young in the podcast recently, remember he said that, we were not depressed or despairing. We were full of joy. You get overwhelmed and you're in a whole other world. And that wins people over. Nonviolent, universal suffering, love, truth, and wisdom become contagious when everything is surrendered to God. So I think the life of surrender to God, to universal love, pushes us out into the thick of things more than we might have thought we could ever do or thought possible, way beyond us, beyond our fears, our worries, our own resentments. We end up joining the struggles and movements for positive social change, and we learn and use the tools of nonviolence, and we learn to act with grace and love and kindness toward ourselves and one another, and dare I say, even in humility and patience, as we support social, racial, economic justice, global disarmament, and environmental sustainability, because we're trying to do the will of God. And yes, we recognize the enormity of the task at hand, but we don't have to act. We don't even have the time to act in despair or apathy or fear or worry. We keep surrendering to God. That's what our focus is on, allowing ourselves to be transformed into extensions of universal love and become, to paraphrase Francis, channels of God's peace. So if we live our lives according to our own wills, doing what we want, what we think is right, even as we work for justice and peace, guided by our own egos and pride and anger and fear, I think you can make a case that the gospel says will be of no use whatsoever. In fact, we will definitely make things worse. If, on the other hand, we surrender ourselves completely to God, as Tutu and Dan Berrigan and Cesar Chavez did, and so many others have talked about, if we let the God of universal love and peace lead us, use us, work through us, then our lives will be helpful and fruitful. Even if we don't know it or see it or can't even understand it, we will have done our part to serve God and humanity and be part of the disarmament of the world. That's the journey. The more we surrender to the God of universal love and peace and God's work of universal love and peace in a world of universal violence and hate and war, the more we will become change agents of God's universal love and peace. And then the more God's universal love and peace can be unleashed into that contagious social, political, global transformative power. Each one of us can become a tipping point person like Rosa Parks, who makes a difference and sparks social change. Together, like drops in the ocean, we can become a wave of nonviolent discernment and transformation for the comings of God's reign. Well, I've been talking forever, and I have so much more I want to say. I've been talking with young Will right up to a few days ago and recording this, and we keep reflecting on how the more we let go of our personal will and endeavor to do only God's will, the will of universal love, the more we notice how different our personal will is from God's will. And the more actually we want to do God's will and cultivate and radiate and practice universal love, compassion, and peace toward everyone. And we find that the more we open ourselves to the will of universal love and peace, the more we have no problem with the politics of God, you could say, or God's plan, or God's way of dealing with the human race and creation, and begins to make sense. That whole question of free will that Archbishop Tutu talked to me about, that becomes the new normal. We no longer care about our personal wishes or the consequences of our political stand based in universal love. We've surrendered ourselves to the God of universal love. So if people reject us or walk away from us or dismiss us because of this politics of universal love and nonviolence, we bless them and respond peacefully, prayerfully, mindfully, always with unconditional love, and get on with the work of peace and justice. We get to practice creative nonviolence now. So life is one adventure after another. And that's what young Will has been telling me, and it's great. That's my experience too. In the end of the book, I talk about the question of choice because that's what Archbishop Tutu said. And you see it in the early books of the Hebrew Bible. I set before you life and death. Choose life that you and your descendants may live. I set before you my will of universal love, compassion, and peace, my way of total nonviolence, or you can follow your own way, which leads to selfishness and ego and control, and therefore violence and harming one another, and then global insanity, nuclear destruction, climate change. And, I just trying to encourage myself and my friends and all of us to choose universal love, compassion, and peace, to choose the way of nonviolence, which means every day to say, I don't know anything, especially as we get older, you can see it. Oh, boy, was I wrong. Okay, I surrender everything to you, God. I only want to do your will from now on every day. Daniel Berrigan put it this way: we must choose to be chosen. That we're chosen, yes, but we have to choose that as well. And with every present moment in the life of surrender from now on, we can and we will try to choose God's will, God's peace, God's universal love. And we're going to try to help each other do that. And Gandhi had a beautiful phrase. I remember reading it. It's in Merton's book of Gandhi's little sayings. Gandhi said, we're going to choose this way of nonviolence, quote, with total disregard to the consequences to ourselves. We're going to live our way into living out the Sermon on the Mount and becoming channels of God's peace, to becoming extensions of universal love. Isn't that beautiful? And that's the journey. And it's really great to try to let go of our own selfishness, to wake up from our apathy and lethargy and blindness and narcissism and the culture's extreme limitations and surrender into God's universal love. We find happiness and peace and friends and God. In the end, we find God. So I've been telling young Will that our motto is surrender, surrender, surrender. That's our new mantra, our path, surrendering over and over again to the God who is universal love, and then giving over our lives in universal love for others. And my hope and prayer for all of us is that each one of us could become who then we were created to be, like Gandhi and Dr. King, Dorothy Day and Rosa Parks, Archbishop Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, and young Will. Extensions of universal love, peacemakers. Thanks very much for listening to this Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can get my new book, Universal Love, at orbisbooks.com or by calling them or going to any local bookstore. And maybe you can get a copy too for a friend or your priest or minister. I'm going to do a live online Zoom presentation on the book on Saturday, April 18th. This is 2026. You can find out more information at beatitudecenter.org, where you can find other programs and podcasts and offer a donation to support this free work, and also sign up there to receive our free regular e-blast with news about upcoming podcasts and Zooms. And thanks for giving us some positive feedback and helping to spread the word by telling friends about this podcast. So may the God of peace bless you all. Keep on following the nonviolent Jesus, and together, friends, let's really surrender our lives to God completely and go out into the fray and resist injustice and war and fascism and become God's extensions of universal love, peace, and nonviolence. See you the next time.